The first city didn't explode. That was the problem. One moment, downtown Chicago was mid-evacuation. Homelander hovering overhead shouting rehearsed reassurances while Vought drones filmed every angle. The next, gravity tilted just enough for buildings to shear sideways, streets folding like paper as if reality had lost interest in holding itself together. Cars slid uphill. People fell into the sky. And then, nothing else happened. No follow-up attack, no explanation. Beerus floated above the wreckage, yawning, tail flicking lazily as if he'd knocked over a glass by accident. He didn't look at Homelander, didn't acknowledge the screaming, the collapsing infrastructure, or the global panic erupting in real time. He simply glanced around, unimpressed, and vanished. Homelander shouted after him, fired lasers into empty air, demanded a response from a god who had already moved on. The destruction didn't escalate, it just lingered. And as the world waited for judgment, for meaning, for a pattern to fight against, one terrifying truth became clear. What happens when a god doesn't care enough to finish the story? If a being powerful enough to erase everything simply got bored and wandered off, how would you survive the uncertainty left behind? Stay with the story, choose carefully, and consider subscribing once as we explore what happens when apathy becomes the most dangerous force in the universe. Beerus did not arrive with thunder. There was no warning system triggered, no spike on military radar, no cosmic event that scientists could point to afterward and say this was the moment everything changed. 1 second, the sky above New York was full of clouds and helicopters. The next, Beerus was simply there, floating a few hundred feet above the Hudson, legs crossed, chin resting in his palm like a man waiting for a late train. The first person to notice him was a traffic helicopter pilot who screamed over an open channel before losing signal entirely. Cameras turned. Phones came out. News tickers scrambled for language they didn't have. Within seconds, Homelander was already in the air, cape snapping violently as he accelerated toward the anomaly with a practiced smile that hadn't cracked yet. This was his role. Unknown threat appears, Homelander arrives, the world exhales. He slowed to a hover several yards away, maintaining what Vought training called visual dominance. Beerus didn't look at him. His eyes drifted instead over the city, unimpressed, as if scanning a menu that hadn't been updated in decades. "Hey," Homelander called out, loud enough for the cameras to catch every syllable. "You're in restricted airspace. You're gonna want to." Beerus yawned. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. Windows rattled. Water beneath them rippled outward in concentric waves, rocking boats hard enough to capsize a few near the shoreline. Homelander flinched despite himself, eyes narrowing as irritation replaced rehearsed confidence. "I'm talking to you," he snapped, heat vision flaring faintly in warning. Beerus finally turned his head, glanced at Homelander for half a second, then looked away again. The dismissal landed harder than a punch. Homelander's jaw tightened, ego stung in a way no villain ever managed. Behind the scenes, Vought command centers lit up. Ashley Barrett barked orders, analysts shouting over one another as threat models failed to populate. No power signature, no compound V markers, no explanation that fit inside a slide deck. "Engage carefully," Ashley ordered. "We need this on our terms." Homelander didn't hear that part. He surged forward instead, grabbing Beerus by the shoulder with enough force to level a city block. "I said." Beerus vanished. Not dodged, not teleported in a way sensors could track. One instant he was there, the next he wasn't, and Homelander's hand closed on empty air. The sudden loss of resistance threw him off balance, sending him tumbling backward before he caught himself mid-air. Beerus reappeared 10 feet to the left, already bored again. Homelander's smile was gone now. "Okay," he muttered, "you want to play it that way." He fired. The heat vision tore through the air in a blinding line, slicing through clouds and carving a molten trench across the river. Boats evaporated. Steam exploded upward. The blast should have been catastrophic. Beerus blinked. The beam stopped existing a few inches from his face, dispersing into harmless light like a bad special effect that forgot its cue. Beerus squinted at the space where it had been, then at Homelander, annoyance flickering for the first time. "That was rude," he said casually. He flicked his finger. The shockwave didn't hit Homelander, it hit the city. Gravity shifted sideways for a heartbeat. Skyscrapers groaned as structural loads redistributed violently. Windows shattered across multiple boroughs. Streets buckled. Homelander was hurled through 3 buildings before he could react, crashing to a halt in a storm of concrete and steel. People screamed. Beerus didn't watch. He turned in midair, gaze drifting toward the skyline like he was already losing interest. "This place is loud," he said to no one in particular, "and fragile." Homelander tore himself free of the wreckage, fury replacing shock. He launched himself back into the air, blood streaking down his temple, cameras catching every second of his humiliation. "You don't get to do that," he roared. "This is my world." Beerus paused. Slowly he looked back. For a brief, terrible moment, Homelander felt seen. Then Beerus shrugged. "I'm bored already." The words hit harder than the shockwave. Beerus lifted one hand and pressed 2 fingers together. The air between them compressed, not violently but indifferently. A section of Manhattan simply slid out of alignment. Buildings leaned at impossible angles. Roads twisted upward into the sky. Physics tried to correct itself and failed. Then Beerus dropped his hand and vanished again. No explosion, no farewell. Just gone. The destruction didn't stop when he left. That was the worst part. Gravity didn't fully settle. Power grids sparked and failed. Emergency sirens wailed over one another in confused layers. Homelander hovered above the chaos, breathing hard, staring at the empty air where Beerus had been. He shouted, "Come back." Nothing answered. In a safe house miles away, Billy Butcher watched the footage with his mouth slightly open. "That's it," he muttered. "No speech, no goal." Huey swallowed. "What do we do?" Butcher shook his head slowly. "Mate, I don't think there is a do." Back at Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett stared at the damage reports pouring in faster than they could be categorized. "Where did he go?" someone demanded. No one had an answer. High above the planet, Beerus floated in silence, already looking elsewhere, already forgetting details that had just shattered millions of lives. He stretched, tail swaying, curiosity already drifting toward something new. Behind him, Earth struggled to stabilize. The god hadn't judged it. He hadn't conquered it. He'd simply stopped paying attention. And the world was about to learn how dangerous that was. The world's first response to Beerus wasn't fear. It was organization. Within hours of the Manhattan distortion, governments activated emergency frameworks that hadn't been touched since the Cold War. Airspace shut down. Markets froze, then reopened under stability provisions. Vought flooded every channel with language meant to slow panic without explaining anything. The incident was framed as an unknown hostile anomaly that had been repelled. Homelander stood at the center of that lie, even as it cracked around him. He gave the speech from a reinforced rooftop, city burning behind him in carefully chosen camera angles. His voice was steady, his posture perfect. He talked about vigilance, about unity, about how threats came and went, but heroes remained. The words landed wrong. The crowd below wasn't cheering. They were watching him like he might slip. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Homelander felt it, the gnawing awareness that Beerus hadn't been repelled. He hadn't retreated. He had wandered off. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Behind the scenes, Ashley Barrett slammed her fist into a conference table hard enough to rattle glasses. "Find him," she snapped. "I don't care how. Satellites, deep space scans, occult divisions. Whatever exists, use it." Analysts exchanged glances. "We don't have a vector," one said carefully. "He didn't leave a trace, no trajectory, no residual energy signature we can track." Ashley stared at the screen showing a freeze frame of Beerus mid-yawn. "Everything leaves something," she said. "We just haven't found it yet." Vought's response escalated anyway. They needed spectacle. They needed proof that power still answered to human systems. Within 24 hours, Vought announced a global readiness demonstration. Multiple SUPs deployed simultaneously across continents. Staged rescues, live feeds, coordinated heroics meant to reassure the public that the world still had guardians. Homelander was front and center. He flew harder, faster, louder than he ever had. He tore through staged threats with unnecessary brutality, making sure the cameras caught every shattered wall and panicked villain. He smiled longer, posed wider, spoke with more conviction. None of it filled the silence Beerus had left behind. Every time Homelander paused between engagements, he scanned the sky instinctively, half expecting that small purple figure to reappear, unimpressed. The thought dug under his skin. Being ignored was worse than being challenged. You couldn't dominate indifference. In a dingy safehouse, the boys watched the coverage in grim silence. Frenchie scoffed. "They're peacocking," he said, "like it matters." Butcher leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. "It matters to them," he replied. "They don't know how to exist without an audience." Huey frowned. "So what happens if the god comes back?" Butcher shook his head. "That's the trick, he doesn't have to." As if to prove the point, Beerus reappeared 3 days later in a completely different hemisphere. No warning, no pattern. One moment, the Australian outback was empty desert. The next, Beerus hovered a few feet above the ground, poking at a termite mound with mild curiosity. The earth responded badly. The pressure of his presence caused the ground to compact unevenly, sending shockwaves rippling outward that collapsed mines and split highways. Military jets scrambled, then aborted when targeting systems failed to lock onto anything that made sense. Beerus looked up once, squinted, then waved his hand dismissively. Every aircraft lost power simultaneously and had to emergency land hundreds of miles away. Beerus sighed, still noisy. Homelander arrived late. He slammed into the desert hard enough to crater the sand, rising slowly, visibly tense. "You," he said, voice strained. "You don't get to just show up and disappear whenever you want." Beerus glanced at him like he'd forgotten he existed. "Oh, you're still here." The words hit like acid. "I'm the strongest man on this planet," Homelander snapped. "You don't ignore me." Beerus tilted his head, genuinely curious for a moment. "Why would I care?" Homelander attacked. Not because it was smart, because it was necessary. He needed a reaction, any reaction, to prove he still mattered. He hit Beerus with everything he had, a relentless barrage of speed and force meant to overwhelm, to demand acknowledgement. Beerus let it happen for several seconds. Then he vanished again, reappearing behind Homelander mid-punch and tapping him lightly between the shoulder blades. Homelander was sent skidding across the desert, bouncing until he came to rest face down in the sand. Beerus looked around, bored already. "Same trick, same noise," he muttered. "You all repeat yourselves." He turned away before Homelander could rise again. This time he didn't vanish immediately. He hovered there, eyes drifting over the horizon, and the desert responded by rearranging. Sand dunes folded into impossible geometries. Rock formations softened like clay. Distance lost meaning as perspective warped subtly, making the world feel smaller, less reliable. Beerus stretched. "I should find somewhere quieter." And then he was gone. The aftermath was worse than the fight. Emergency responders struggled with terrain that no longer obeyed maps. Scientists couldn't explain why measurements didn't line up anymore. Something fundamental had shifted, not broken, misaligned. Homelander sat in the sand long after Beerus left, breathing hard, fists trembling. Cameras caught the moment he punched the ground in frustration, screaming at empty sky. That clip went viral within minutes. Back in New York, Ashley Barrett watched it on loop, dread settling into her bones. "He's not engaging," she whispered. "He's not escalating." One of her analysts looked up slowly. "He's sampling." Ashley swallowed. Then what happens when he decides he's had enough? High above the planet, Beerus drifted lazily through space, glancing back once at the blue sphere behind him. It felt small, repetitive, predictable. Not worth destroying, but maybe worth leaving altered. Below, humanity scrambled to respond to a threat that refused to behave like one. And somewhere in the distance, reality bent slightly out of shape, waiting for the next moment Beerus decided to poke it again. Vought's problem wasn't Beerus. It was silence. There were no demands, no ultimatum, no threat pattern that could be modeled, marketed, or spun into a victory. Every system Vought had ever relied on assumed opposition wanted something: money, attention, control, survival. Beerus wanted none of it. He appeared, disrupted reality like someone rearranging furniture out of mild irritation, then left without checking the damage. You couldn't negotiate with that. So Vought did what it always did when reality refused to cooperate. They tried to rewrite it. Ashley Barrett stood in a sealed briefing room surrounded by executives, generals, and consultants whose job titles had never included the word panic, but whose faces suggested nothing else. "We don't need to beat him," she said carefully. "We need to matter to him." A general frowned. "You just watched him ignore the most powerful soup on the planet." "Exactly," Ashley replied. "Which means power isn't the hook, attention is." Vought launched Operation Spotlight within hours. It wasn't a weapon deployment. It was a narrative escalation. Massive, coordinated soup operations rolled out across every major city, bigger than anything before. Catastrophes were resolved live. Villains were paraded. Collateral damage quietly buried under hero montages and swelling music. The message was simple. This world is interesting. Stay and watch. Homelander was everywhere. He barely slept, chasing relevance like oxygen. Every rescue was louder, every threat neutralized with unnecessary force. He spoke directly into cameras, not to the public, but upward, toward wherever Beerus might be drifting. "You see this?" Homelander shouted after tearing a tanker truck in half to stop a staged explosion. "This is what real power looks like. This is worth your time." The words sounded hollow even to him. The boys saw through it immediately. "This isn't about stopping him," Butcher growled, watching the feeds. "It's about waving keys in front of a bored god." "And if it works?" Huey asked. Butcher shook his head. "Then we're all screwed." Beerus noticed. Not because the spectacle impressed him, but because it annoyed him. He reappeared during one of Vought's largest broadcasts yet, hovering over a city-sized set piece designed to look like a coordinated disaster response. Hundreds of cameras caught the moment he materialized midair, tail flicking lazily as he took in the scene. Fires screaming, subs performing choreographed heroics. Beerus sighed. "This again." Homelander froze mid-speech when he felt it. The pressure, the wrongness, the sudden certainty that Beerus was watching. He turned slowly, eyes wide, smile snapping into place out of habit. "There you are," he said, relief and desperation bleeding through. "See, we listened. We're showing you what we can do." Beerus looked at him for a long second, then glanced down at the city. "You made it louder," he said, "not better." He snapped his fingers. Every screen went dark. Not exploded, not fried. Off. Cameras died. Broadcast signals vanished. Phones lost reception simultaneously across the city. The carefully staged disaster became real in an instant as coordination collapsed. Fires spread unchecked. Civilians panicked without instructions. Sups froze, suddenly unsure who was watching. Beerus floated lower, unimpressed. "If this is what keeps you entertained," he muttered, "you're exhausting." Homelander rushed him again, slower this time, cautious but frantic. "Wait," he said. "You don't get it. This world, this planet, it's not boring, we just—" Beerus raised one hand. Homelander stopped midair, suspended by nothing visible. His muscles strained uselessly, as if pushing against an invisible wall that didn't care about strength. "I didn't ask for a presentation," Beerus said. "I wandered in. You followed me around like a child demanding praise." The city beneath them warped subtly. Buildings leaned inward, perspective skewing just enough to make the skyline feel claustrophobic. Wrong. People screamed as gravity shifted unpredictably, tossing cars sideways and snapping bridges like toys. Beerus released Homelander, who dropped hard into the street below. "This," Beerus continued, already losing interest, "is why I get bored." He vanished again without warning. The damage didn't reset when he left. Gravity stayed unreliable. Technology stuttered. The city became a patchwork of zones where physics behaved differently. Emergency crews struggled to operate in spaces where distance stretched or compressed without warning. Vought's spectacle had backfired spectacularly. Ashley watched the aftermath in numb silence. "We forced his attention," she whispered. An analyst swallowed, and he punished us for wasting it. Across the city, Homelander pulled himself from the rubble, bloodied, furious, humiliated on a global scale before the feeds went dark. For the first time, the public didn't see him as a shield. They saw him as bait. In a safe house, Butcher exhaled slowly. "That's it," he said. "They made it worse." Huey looked at the footage of warped streets and screaming civilians. "He's not trying to destroy us, is he?" Butcher shook his head. "No, that's the problem. He doesn't care enough." High above Earth, Beerus drifted through space again, tail swaying in irritation. "Too much noise," he muttered. "Too much effort." He glanced back once at the planet, eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe I should see what happens if I stop visiting altogether." Below, reality creaked under the weight of attention it never should have tried to earn. And humanity began to realize the worst possible outcome wasn't being judged. It was being forgotten mid-disaster. Beerus did not return. At first, that felt like relief. No new distortions tore through cities. No sudden appearances above capitals or disaster zones. The warped pockets of reality he had left behind stabilized just enough for emergency crews to adapt, though no one could explain why certain streets still bent at odd angles or why sound traveled strangely in some neighborhoods. Scientists called it residual anomaly. Vought called it contained fallout. The public called it waiting. Days passed, then a week, and the silence began to hurt. Without Beerus as a focal point, every system built around reaction started to malfunction. Governments didn't know which threat briefings to prioritize. Military exercises lost urgency without a target. Vought's internal projections spiraled as the unthinkable possibility settled in. What if this was it? What if the god didn't come back to finish anything? Ashley Barrett sat in her office long after midnight, watching feeds of damaged cities slowly returning to routine. Repairs happened. Life resumed. And with every passing hour, the narrative that Vought had survived Beerus began to harden into something dangerous. People stopped asking when he would return. They started asking why he ever came at all. Homelander felt that shift immediately. He stood in front of a mirror in Vought Tower, adjusting his suit for the third time in 10 minutes. The reflection stared back, perfect as ever, but something was missing. The edge. The sense that the world revolved around his presence. Ever since Beerus vanished, Homelander's appearances drew fewer headlines. Ratings dipped. The public's attention drifted toward rebuilding stories, human resilience, and community efforts that didn't need a flying godman to validate them. Being ignored by Beerus had been humiliating. Being slowly replaced by normalcy was worse. He flew patrols constantly, responding to crimes that barely made the news. He lingered after rescues, forcing smiles, waiting for applause that came late or not at all. Each moment without recognition gnawed at him. "They're moving on," he muttered one night, hovering above the city. "They can't move on." Below him, traffic flowed. People laughed. The world kept going without asking his permission. In a safe house across town, the boys felt the same unease from a different angle. Butcher paced the room like a caged animal, jaw tight, fists clenched. "This isn't how it's supposed to end," he snapped. "No explosion, no reckoning, just nothing." Huey leaned back on the couch, eyes tired. "Maybe that's the point." Butcher rounded on him. "Don't give me that Zen crap. If he's gone, then all this," he gestured vaguely at the world outside. "It just goes back to the same bloody mess." Frenchie frowned. "Except worse, because now everyone knows how small we are." That was the problem. Beerus hadn't destroyed the world. He'd exposed it. Across the globe, smaller anomalies began to surface. Not new attacks, but delayed consequences. Areas Beerus had passed through behaved unpredictably. Weather patterns stuttered. Power grids failed without cause. In some regions, time seemed to lag just enough to cause accidents that couldn't be explained. No God was present, but his boredom lingered. Vought scrambled to manage the fallout, spinning every incident as unrelated. But behind closed doors, analysts saw the pattern forming. Beerus's casual actions had nudged reality out of alignment, and without his presence to anchor or correct anything, the planet was adjusting on its own terms. Badly. Ashley listened as a scientist tried to explain it. "It's like he flicked a table," the man said, voice shaking. "And now everything on it is still wobbling. If he doesn't come back, we don't know where it settles." Ashley stared at the data. "So find a way to bring him back." The room went quiet. "Not fight him," she added quickly. "Not provoke him, just remind him we exist." The suggestion felt obscene. And yet plans were drafted. Vought began subtle global signaling, not spectacles this time, but disturbances designed to ping whatever awareness Beerus had used to notice the planet in the first place. Energy spikes, experimental physics tests, anything unusual enough to register without screaming desperation. It didn't work. Beerus did not respond. High above the planet, far beyond human detection, Beerus lounged in the quiet of open space, eyes half-lidded. Earth drifted behind him, a blue dot already fading into the background of his attention. He wasn't angry. He wasn't judging. He was simply done. "Predictable," he muttered, thinking of the shouting man in red and blue, the frantic systems, the noise. He rolled onto his side, considering whether to nap or move on entirely. Below, the consequences accelerated. A major city lost gravity for 3 seconds. Not enough to kill everyone, just enough to drop planes, rupture buildings, and permanently alter the skyline. Panic followed. Markets crashed. Faith in institutions eroded further as leaders admitted, off the record, that they didn't know how to stop whatever was happening. Homelander arrived late to the scene, hovering helplessly as rescue crews pulled bodies from wreckage he couldn't fix. Cameras caught him watching instead of acting. The image spread fast. A god who couldn't help. That night, Homelander snapped. He stormed into Vought Tower's highest executive floor, lasers burning holes in walls as he screamed for answers. "Bring him back," he roared. "You brought him here. Fix it." Ashley didn't flinch. "He didn't come for us," she said quietly. "He came because he was bored." Homelander stared at her, breathing hard. "Then make him bored again." The room froze. Ashley realized then that Homelander didn't want Beerus gone. He wanted an audience that couldn't look away. In space, Beerus suddenly paused mid-stretch. He felt it, not a threat, not an attack, but a disturbance so clumsy it was almost insulting. A ripple of artificial noise reaching outward, brushing against his awareness like a child tugging at a sleeve. He opened one eye. "Oh," he murmured. Below, Earth shook again, just slightly, as if reacting to the shift in his attention. Beerus turned slowly, gaze drifting back toward the planet he tried to forget. The silence broke, and whatever came next wouldn't be because humanity had been judged. It would be because they refused to be ignored. Beerus did not return out of anger. That misunderstanding would cost the world dearly. The first sign wasn't visual, it was structural. Across multiple continents, background radiation readings spiked and fell in rhythmic pulses that didn't correspond to any known cosmic phenomenon. Gravity wobbled in places that had never been touched before. Tides rose and receded minutes early. Time stamps on synchronized atomic clocks drifted apart by microseconds that no system could reconcile. To Beerus, it wasn't a call for help. It was noise. He reappeared above the Pacific without ceremony, floating just above the water's surface as if testing whether it would ripple beneath him. It didn't. The ocean flattened unnaturally, waves freezing in half-formed arcs for miles in every direction. Beerus frowned. "That's new," he muttered, mildly curious. The world reacted instantly. Satellites caught the anomaly. Submarine sensors failed. Emergency broadcasts interrupted programming mid-sentence. Within minutes, every government and corporation with access to classified channels knew the truth. He was back. Homelander was already airborne before anyone could stop him, breaking the sound barrier in his haste. He didn't wait for instructions. He didn't wait for permission. He couldn't afford to. If Beerus was here, Homelander needed him to look. He arrived over the frozen sea and hovered at a careful distance this time, chest heaving, voice measured with forced calm. "Hey," he called. "You felt it too, right? Something's wrong." Beerus glanced at him briefly, then looked back down at the water. He tapped the surface with one clawed toe. The ocean responded by sinking several feet, exposing seabed that had never seen daylight. "Yes," Beerus said, "something is wrong." Homelander swallowed, hope flaring. "Then help us fix it. You're the only one who can." Beerus turned his head slowly. "Why would I do that?" The question wasn't hostile, it was sincere. Homelander opened his mouth, then stopped. The answers that always worked, duty, protection, strength, sounded ridiculous when said aloud. "Because it's your fault," he said finally. Beerus blinked once. Then he laughed. The sound rolled across the frozen ocean, cracking the surface like glass. Fault lines spread outward for miles as pressure shifted unpredictably. Homelander staggered midair, barely keeping himself upright. "My fault," Beerus repeated, amused. "I didn't ask you to shout into the void." He lifted his hand and snapped his fingers. Not hard, not fast. The artificial disturbances Vought had engineered to get his attention vanished instantly. Energy spikes collapsed. Experimental reactors shut down. Exotic physics tests failed catastrophically, not exploding, but becoming inert, useless husks. The noise stopped. What remained was worse. The damage the noise had caused didn't undo itself. The instability persisted, now unsupported, like a structure with its scaffolding ripped away mid-build. Fault lines deepened. Weather systems collided violently. Cities felt the strain as systems dependent on precise constants began to drift. Beerus sighed. "You're terrible at this." Homelander clenched his fists. "You can't just leave it like this." Beerus tilted his head. "Watch me." He turned away, already losing interest again, when something unexpected happened. A military strike group, operating on pre-authorization protocols triggered by Beerus's return, launched. Not because anyone thought it would work. Because doing nothing felt worse. Missiles streaked across the sky in a blinding swarm, dozens of them converging on Beerus's position in a display of pure panic disguised as resolve. Homelander spun toward them, shouting into comms, "Abort! Abort now!" Too late. Beerus didn't look up. The missiles didn't explode. They stopped. Midair, frozen like insects in amber. Beerus glanced at them unimpressed, still noisy. He closed his fist. The missiles compressed into a sphere the size of a basketball, metal screaming as impossible forces crushed it inward. Then the sphere vanished, not detonated, not destroyed, simply removed. Beerus turned back toward Homelander, eyes half-lidded with irritation. "This is why I was bored. You confuse activity with meaning." Homelander snapped. He rushed Beerus again, screaming, swinging wildly, not to win but to matter. Beerus let the first punch connect. Homelander's fist shattered. The sound was wet and final. Bone fragments drifted in the air as Homelander screamed, clutching his ruined hand. Beerus hadn't blocked, hadn't hardened himself. He'd simply remained what he was. "Stop flailing," Beerus said flatly. "It's embarrassing." He flicked Homelander away like lint. Homelander slammed into the ocean hard enough to unfreeze it in a violent explosion of water and steam, disappearing beneath the surface. Beerus hovered there for a moment longer, surveying the chaos. The instability hadn't improved. If anything, it had accelerated, not because he'd attacked, but because his presence disrupted systems already pushed past tolerance. "This place breaks itself," he said quietly. "I just notice." In a safe house, Butcher watched the live feeds cut in and out as networks struggled to keep up. "They poked him again," he growled. "They couldn't help themselves." Huey stared at the frozen missiles replaying on screen. "So what now?" Butcher exhaled. "Now we find out what happens when the noise stops but the god stays." Back over the Pacific, Homelander burst from the water, hand regenerating slowly, eyes wild with rage and humiliation. "You don't get to do this," he shouted hoarsely. "You don't get to wreck everything and walk away." Beerus looked at him one last time. "I do," he said simply. Then Beerus vanished. Not drifting off. Not teleporting nearby. Gone in a way that made the space he'd occupied feel thinner. The instability didn't follow him. It stayed. Oceans surged unpredictably. Storms collided. Tectonic plates ground against one another with renewed violence. The planet began correcting for a presence that had brushed against it and moved on. Homelander hovered alone above the chaos, shaking, screaming into empty sky as the world burned without a villain to blame or a god to confront. Far away, Beerus floated in silence again, tail swaying gently. "That should keep them busy," he muttered, already turning his attention elsewhere. Behind him, Earth screamed, not from destruction but from being left unfinished. The hardest thing to fight was the absence. There was no enemy to aim missiles at, no presence to track, no heat signature, no energy reading, no looming figure in the sky demanding a response. Beerus was gone, and with him went the only thing the world could point to and say, "That's the problem." What remained was consequence without cause. Across the planet, systems began failing in ways no disaster protocol had prepared for. Not catastrophically all at once, but unevenly, inconsistently, as if reality itself had lost its calibration. Satellites drifted off assigned orbits by fractions of degrees that compounded into chaos. GPS systems desensed. Financial markets froze after automated trading algorithms began reacting to time stamps that no longer lined up. The world wasn't ending. It was unraveling. In Washington, emergency sessions blurred into one another as analysts tried to map the damage. Every model assumed an ongoing threat, an active hostile force. None of them could process a scenario where the destabilizing factor had already left. They kept asking the same question in different words. How do we stop him? There was no answer, because the correct question was one no one wanted to ask. What if he doesn't come back? Vought moved faster than governments, not because it understood the situation better, but because it couldn't afford to look like it didn't. Within hours, executives were on camera, faces carefully arranged into practiced concern. Statements were issued about unprecedented environmental anomalies and temporary global instability events. The word Beerus was never spoken. Behind closed doors, panic ruled. The strongest weapon they had ever built lay inert in its containment facility, systems fried by Beerus's casual dismissal. Engineers tore it apart, desperate to find something, anything, that could be reactivated, repurposed, rebranded as hope. All they found were limits they'd been lying about for years. They didn't have gods. They had products. Homelander watched the broadcasts from a high-altitude hover, drifting aimlessly above a storm front that shouldn't exist. His hand had healed. His pride hadn't. Every channel talked around what had happened, reframing it as a natural disaster, an act of nature, something impersonal. He needed it to be personal. He dove into the storm, lightning crackling around him as he screamed into the clouds, unleashing heat vision into the sky. Thunder answered, but not because it feared him. The storm was just following physics that no longer cared what he symbolized. For the first time, Homelander wasn't being ignored by a god. He was being ignored by the world. In New York, the boys regrouped in a half-abandoned subway station that had become their default shelter. The air smelled like damp concrete and ozone from failing power lines above. Huey scrolled through his phone, watching clips of disasters piling up. "No pattern," he said quietly. "It's like the universe forgot how it's supposed to work." Butcher leaned against a pillar, jaw clenched. "Nah, it remembers. It's just not asking our permission anymore." MM spread out maps on a crate, red circles marking incidents. If this was an attack, we could respond. If it was random, we could ride it out. This is neither. Frenchie shook his head. It's aftermath, like stepping into a room after a bomb went off and the dust hasn't settled yet. Kimiko stared at the screen, eyes narrowing at footage of Homelander hovering uselessly over a flooded city, screaming orders no one could hear over the wind. Butcher followed her gaze. "Look at him, he's got nothing. No target, no script, no god to punch." "And that scares him more than Beerus ever did," Huey said. Homelander finally snapped. He landed in Times Square unannounced, cracking pavement and shattering already damaged screens. Cameras turned instantly. He straightened his suit, forced a smile, and began talking. Promises, reassurance, strength, control. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched. Someone shouted, "Where were you?" Another voice followed, "Why didn't you stop it?" Homelander's smile twitched. "I am stopping it," he said too loudly. "This is under control." A tremor rippled through the street, knocking people off their feet. The city didn't care about his confidence. The moment stretched unbearable. Homelander felt it slipping, the belief, the role, the meaning. He fired his lasers into the sky again, not to hit anything but to remind them. The crowd scattered in fear, but it wasn't reverence. It was avoidance. Miles away in orbit, instruments registered a familiar disturbance. Not large, not violent, just present. Space bent subtly like fabric catching on a passing nail. Beerus hovered there upside down, watching the planet spin. "So loud," he muttered, and still nothing to say. He tapped reality experimentally. A minor adjustment. On Earth, a hurricane stalled unnaturally, spinning in place for hours longer than it should have before collapsing into torrential rain over land already drowning. Beerus frowned again. Messy. He yawned and drifted farther away, not out of malice, but because the novelty was fatting. Earth wasn't entertaining him anymore. It wasn't even annoying him. It was just fragile. Back below, governments finally accepted the truth they'd been avoiding. This wasn't a threat they could deter. It wasn't an enemy they could defeat. It was damage left behind by something that had brushed past and moved on. Containment strategies replaced attack plans. Borders closed. Resources were hoarded. Trust evaporated. Every nation acted alone because coordination required stability, and stability was gone. The world shrank. Homelander hovered above the Atlantic at sunset, watching the horizon burn red through atmospheric distortion. He whispered Beerus's name into the wind, not as a challenge, but as a plea. Nothing answered. In that silence, the most terrifying realization settled in. Beerus hadn't broken the world. He'd just shown it how easily it could break itself. And somewhere beyond the stars, a bored god decided whether or not to ever look back. The absence became policy. Governments stopped asking when Beerus would return and started drafting contingencies for a future where he never did. Emergency powers, once justified as temporary, hardened into permanence. Borders closed not because of invasion, but because cooperation no longer made sense in a world where reality itself could misfire without warning. Every nation retreated inward, hoarding resources, stockpiling energy, pretending that isolation could substitute for certainty. It didn't. Weather systems remained unstable, not apocalyptic, just wrong enough to disrupt everything they touched. Crops failed in regions that had fed millions for decades. Oceans shifted currents subtly, breaking shipping routes and collapsing fisheries. Infrastructure designed for predictability buckled under constant adjustment. Engineers could fix a bridge, but they couldn't fix the fact that gravity no longer behaved exactly the same way every day. The world wasn't ending loudly. It was eroding quietly. Vought tried to fill the vacuum with meaning. They always had. Within days, a new narrative emerged. Beerus was framed as an anomaly that had passed through their universe, leaving behind turbulence that would settle with time. Vought positioned itself as humanity's stabilizing force, the only institution with experience managing superhuman-scale crises. New initiatives were announced. New guardians teased. Old footage of Homelander saving lives was recycled endlessly. Behind the scenes, it was desperation. Every suit tested after Beerus's arrival showed diminishing returns. Powers flickered. Regeneration lagged. Abilities tied to physics, flight, energy projection, enhanced strength, became unreliable in small but terrifying ways. Compound V wasn't failing. The environment it operated in was. Ashley Barrett sat in a glass conference room staring at charts that refused to make sense. "We don't sell stability," she said quietly. "We sell symbols, and symbols don't work when the rules change." No one argued. Homelander felt the shift more acutely than anyone else. His powers still worked, mostly, but not with the same unquestioned authority. Flight took more effort. Heat vision required focus. Strength fluctuated unpredictably. Every inconsistency felt like a personal insult, a reminder that something fundamental had slipped out of his control. He compensated the only way he knew how. He overperformed. Homelander began appearing everywhere, unannounced, inserting himself into disasters whether he was needed or not. He rescued people from floods already receding. He lifted debris no one was trapped under. He shouted commands at emergency responders who ignored him. Cameras caught every second, but the footage felt off. The smiles were too tight. The speeches too loud. The world didn't need a god right now. It needed answers. The boys watched it all unfold from a safe house that rotated every few days as systems failed unpredictably. Butcher was angrier than Huey had ever seen him, not at Homelander, not even at Vought, but at the shape of the problem itself. "You can't fight indifference," he snapped. "You can't punch boredom." Huey nodded slowly. "It's like the universe got audited and found us uninteresting." Leaned back, arms crossed. So what's the move? Butcher laughed without humor. There isn't one. That's the point. We're not players anymore. We're background noise. That realization hit harder than any soup ever had. People began changing their behavior in small, telling ways. Church attendance spiked, then plummeted when no answers came. Cult activity surged, fractured, collapsed. Some worshipped Beerus as a god who would return. Others cursed him as a devil who had abandoned them. Most stopped believing in anything larger than the next day. Meaning became local, personal, fragile. In Los Angeles, a wildfire burned for weeks without spreading or dying, locked in place by atmospheric conditions that refused to resolve. Firefighters rotated endlessly, exhausted, unable to understand why the fire line wouldn't move. Scientists called it a persistent anomaly. The public called it cursed. Homelander flew over it, hovering uselessly as the flames reflected in his eyes. He could put it out, he knew that. One sustained blast of heat, vision inverted, one massive displacement of air. But something stopped him. If he fixed it, it would prove the world still needed him. If he failed, that truth would be final. He left. That footage never aired. Above Earth, Beerus drifted through low orbit again, more out of habit than interest. He watched continents adjust to damage they didn't understand, watched systems compensate for a variable they couldn't name. The planet felt smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because its ambitions had. So noisy before, Beerus murmured, so quiet now. He flicked his wrist experimentally. On Earth, every screen went black for 3 seconds. Just 3. Power returned immediately. No explosions, no permanent damage, but in those 3 seconds every system lost synchronization. Aircraft instruments reset, hospital machines rebooted, nuclear facilities went into emergency shutdown, markets froze again. Panic spiked globally. Beerus smiled faintly, still reacts. He vanished again, bored but not finished. The boys felt it in their bones when the blackout hit. Huey clutched the table, heart racing. That was him. Butcher nodded. Yeah, and that wasn't an accident. Kimiko signed urgently, hands sharp. He's checking if we still care. But that's the worst part, said quietly. We do. Homelander didn't take the blackout well. He landed at Vought Tower without warning, shattering the upper floors and storming into the executive level. Ashley barely had time to look up before he grabbed her desk and hurled it through a wall. You said I was enough, he roared. You said they needed me. Ashley stood frozen, terrified but honest in a way she'd never been before. They needed certainty. You were never that. You were just loud. The words hit harder than Beerus's indifference ever had. Homelander stared at her, breathing hard, then laughed, a brittle cracking sound. He backed away slowly, eyes darting as if searching for an audience that wasn't there. I can fix this, he said, not to her but to himself. I just need him to look at me. He shot upward through the ceiling, accelerating past clouds, past atmosphere, screaming Beerus's name into space. Nothing answered. But something moved. Far beyond the moon, a subtle shift rippled through space, like a massive body adjusting its position. Beerus paused mid-drift, ears twitching. That sound again, he muttered, persistent. He turned, not toward Earth, but toward something else entirely. And on the planet below, instruments began detecting a new anomaly, not above them, but approaching. Whatever Beerus had just noticed, it wasn't bored. The first warning came from observatories that no one listened to anymore. Telescopes across the world picked up a distortion moving against the grain of known spacetime patterns, not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate. It wasn't entering the solar system like an invasion. It was arriving like an appointment. Scientists flagged it, escalated it, then watched their reports stall in bureaucratic channels that no longer believed in solutions. The second warning came from Beerus. He stopped drifting. For the first time since entering this universe, the god of destruction focused, not out of concern but irritation. His tail stilled. His eyes narrowed slightly as he felt the anomaly press against the edges of reality, subtle but intrusive. Whatever it wasn't native to this universe, and it wasn't random. It was intentional. Beerus muttered, "Now this place wants company." On Earth, panic found a new shape. Unlike Beerus, this presence didn't arrive through accidents or quiet distortions. The skies above multiple continents began to glow faintly, like reflections from a light source that didn't exist yet. Gravity stabilized unnaturally. Weather systems froze mid-motion. The chaos that had defined the last weeks abruptly paused, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. For the first time since Beerus arrived, something imposed order. Vought noticed immediately. Ashley Barrett stared at incoming data with disbelief edging into hope. "Whatever that is," she said, voice tight, "it's correcting the anomalies." Engineers confirmed it. Energy fluctuations flattened. Power grids stabilized. Satellite drift ceased. For the first time since Chicago folded sideways, systems began behaving normally again. The room buzzed with something dangerous. Optimism. Vought spun fast. Press releases went out before analysts finished speaking. A new narrative formed almost instantly. Beerus had been chaos. This was balance, a stabilizing force, a counterweight. A solution. Homelander felt it too. He hovered above the Pacific, staring at the sky as the air around him settled into familiar patterns. His flight felt easier. His strength returned cleanly. The pressure in his chest eased for the first time in weeks. He smiled. "That's it," he whispered. Someone finally showed up to deal with him. The boys weren't convinced. Butcher watched the same feeds with narrowed eyes, arms crossed. "Yeah, no, that's not help, that's competition." Huey frowned. Competition for who? Butcher didn't answer right away. He was staring at a single line of data scrolling past the screen, something buried beneath the reassuring headlines. Non-native influence detected. Beerus felt the presence cross an invisible threshold and finally turned fully toward it. The anomaly resolved itself into a shape only he could properly perceive, an entity that enforced rules rather than broke them. Something that existed to maintain structure across unstable realities. Not a god. A custodian. "Really?" Beerus said, unimpressed. "They sent maintenance." The custodian did not respond verbally. It didn't need to. Its presence alone forced local reality into alignment, smoothing the fractures Beerus had left behind. On Earth, people cheered as storms dissipated and fires finally spread and died like they were supposed to. The relief was overwhelming, which made it dangerous. Homelander rocketed into the sky without waiting for permission, flying straight toward the anomaly with renewed confidence. Cameras tracked him, broadcasting the moment globally. He spoke as he flew, voice booming with rehearsed authority. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he declared. "I'm here." The custodian didn't react. Homelander slowed, hovering uncertainly as he approached something that didn't acknowledge him at all. He frowned, circling it like a shark, firing a controlled burst of heat vision to test it. The beam dispersed harmlessly, absorbed into corrected space. Homelander scowled. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Beerus watched from a distance, amused despite himself. "Ah, so loud, always." The custodian finally acted, not against Homelander but around him. Space locked. Gravity snapped into perfect alignment. Homelander found himself pinned midair, not restrained, just irrelevant. The entity adjusted the environment as if Homelander were debris cluttering a clean system. The cameras caught everything. The world watched its strongest symbol, reduced to background noise. Vought's optimism cracked instantly. "That's not stabilizing," Ashley whispered. "That's overwriting." Systems on Earth surged again, this time in the opposite direction. Where Beerus had caused chaos, the custodian imposed rigidity. Emergency generators failed because they weren't meant to operate in perfectly synchronized grids. Organic systems, human systems, began suffering under rules too strict for life. Hospitals reported equipment functioning flawlessly while patients crashed inexplicably. Crops grew too uniformly and then died. The planet wasn't built for perfection. Beerus sighed. "Oh, this is worse," he said. "No imagination at all." He moved. Not aggressively, not dramatically. He simply appeared beside the custodian, close enough that the universe flinched. For the first time, the entity reacted, its corrective field stuttering under Beerus's presence. Beerus leaned in, eyes half-lidded. "You're fixing things wrong." The custodian responded, not with force but with authority. It attempted to assert control, expanding its field, trying to normalize Beerus like an error. Beerus blinked. Then he yawned. The correction field shattered like glass, reality snapping back violently. On Earth, the sudden release sent shockwaves through stabilized systems, plunging regions back into chaos. The custodian recoiled, damaged, not destroyed but disrupted in a way it clearly hadn't anticipated. Beerus floated there, bored again but now annoyed. "I was done with this place," he muttered. "You don't get to tidy it up after me." Below, the world reeled. Vought's narrative collapsed completely. The savior they'd hoped for was gone as quickly as it arrived. Homelander fell out of the sky, crashing into the ocean, dragged down by forces he couldn't understand. The boys watched in stunned silence. "So," Huey said slowly, "we just watched boredom beat order." Butcher nodded grimly. "Yeah, and that's the scariest combo there is." Beerus looked back at Earth one last time, irritation fatting back into apathy. He wasn't interested in ruling, saving, or correcting this universe. But he didn't like interference. He turned away, drifting toward the void, leaving behind a planet now broken in two different directions, one by chaos, the other by control. Neither fit. And as the custodian limped away into the dark, something deeper stirred in the fabric of reality itself, reacting not to Beerus's power, but to his indifference. Being noticed was worse than being attacked. The custodian's retreat didn't restore balance. It tore a seam. The universe, stretched between Beerus's indifference and the custodian's rigidity, began producing consequences that belonged to neither. Reality didn't collapse, it compensated. And compensation always came at a price paid by whoever happened to be standing closest. On Earth, that meant people. Cities reported zones where sound arrived before movement, where shadows lagged a half-second behind bodies, where reflections blinked when no one moved. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines on its own. Together, it created a constant, crawling unease, a sense that the world was no longer agreeing with itself. Governments issued advisories no one understood. Scientists stopped naming phenomena and started numbering them, as if classification alone could keep things contained. The phrase non-hostile anomaly became a catch-all that explained nothing and reassured no one. Beerus drifted farther from Earth, not out of guilt or mercy, but because his interest had finally dimmed. The interruption had annoyed him, and annoyance had passed. Now there was only residue. He watched it the way one watches ripples fade after tossing a stone. "Still noisy," he muttered, glancing back. The noise came from Earth, not in volume but in insistence. Humanity refused to stop reacting. Every attempt to stabilize, to measure, to understand sent another pulse through the already stressed fabric of reality. Each pulse echoed farther than the last. That echo was what noticed them. In a subterranean Vought facility reactivated under emergency authority, engineers worked around the clock on a project that had been shelved decades earlier. It had no branding, no hero name, no marketing plan, just a designation and a purpose. Project Atlas. Ashley Barrett stood behind reinforced glass, watching as the chamber sealed. "This isn't a weapon," she said, voice tight. "It's a beacon." The scientists didn't argue. Atlas wasn't meant to fight Beerus. No one was stupid enough to suggest that. It was meant to anchor reality, to provide a fixed point strong enough that anomalies would resolve around it. A stabilizer born of compound V, quantum modeling, and corporate desperation. They flipped the switch. Across the planet, anomalies paused. Then they leaned inward. The world didn't cheer this time. People felt it, a pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest, like gravity had gained opinions. Atlas wasn't fixing reality, it was forcing it to behave. Beerus stopped drifting. He felt the pull immediately, not on his body, but on the universe around him. Something down there was asserting permanence in a place that had already failed to earn it. He said, still trying. Homelander felt it too. He lay on a Vought medical platform, bones knitting, pride shattered. The pressure made his teeth ache. For the first time since Beerus arrived, something noticed him again, not as a symbol but as mass, as data, as interference. He smiled weakly. "See," he whispered, "I told you we just needed structure." The boys watched the activation from a stolen broadcast feed. Butcher's expression darkened instantly. "They're poking the universe again." Huey swallowed. "Isn't that what everyone's been trying to do?" "Yeah," Butcher snapped, "and that's why it keeps hitting back." Atlas escalated on its own. Designed to respond to instability, it interpreted Beerus's lingering influence as an unresolved variable. Power output spiked automatically. Reality bent inward harder, tightening around fixed points, cities, fault lines, population centers. Earth screamed, not audibly, but mathematically. Beerus turned fully now, annoyance sharpening into something colder. Not anger, not rage, displeasure. He appeared above the atmosphere, staring down at a planet daring to define itself in his wake. "I left," he said softly. "That should have been enough." Atlas reacted. Not intelligently, not bravely. It did what it was built to do. It targeted the greatest source of destabilization and attempted to anchor that. For the first time, something on Earth reached for Beerus. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Gravity inverted across half the hemisphere. Oceans bulged upward. Cities groaned as foundations twisted under forces they were never meant to feel. Atlas burned white-hot as it tried to lock onto something that did not accept being defined. Beerus stared at the tug on reality, unimpressed but irritated. "No," he said simply. He didn't attack Atlas. He stepped away. The anchor snapped back violently. Earth paid the price. Seismic waves tore through continents. The pressure release shattered Atlas's containment, vaporizing half the facility and erasing Project Atlas from existence in less than a second. Vought's strongest attempt at control vanished without even earning Beerus's direct attention. Homelander was thrown from the platform, screaming as the shockwave ripped through the complex. He hit the ground hard, powers flaring uselessly as the system that had propped him up finally failed. Above it all, Beerus sighed. "Messy," he said again. The boys barely survived the quake, clinging to support beams as their hideout partially collapsed. When it settled, Huey looked up, eyes wide. He didn't even do anything. Butcher nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the point." Beerus looked down one last time. Not at Homelander, not at Vought, at the planet itself, shaking under the weight of its own insistence. "You noticed me," he said, voice carrying through space without effort. "And now you want me to fix what that noticing broke." He turned away. Behind him, the universe adjusted again, this time without guidance, without anchors, without hope of correction. Earth stabilized, not because it was fixed, but because it had run out of ways to resist. Something else noticed that too. Far beyond Beerus's awareness, beyond even the custodian's reach, a deeper mechanism shifted. Not a god, not a caretaker. A response. Beerus paused mid-drift, ears twitching, expression shifting from boredom to mild curiosity. "Oh," he murmured, "that's new." Below, the world felt it as a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. And this time, whatever was coming wasn't interested in Earth. It was interested in him. The response did not arrive like an invasion. There were no portals tearing open the sky, no fleets blotting out stars, no warnings broadcast in symbols or flame. The universe answered Beerus the way a system answers an error it cannot ignore, quietly, comprehensively, and everywhere at once. Across deep space, Constance adjusted. Not dramatically enough to alarm civilizations that still trusted their equations, but just enough to redirect probabilities. Stars burned a fraction cooler. Dark matter distributions shifted like a tide changing direction. Causality tightened, smoothing paths that had once allowed gods to wander freely between outcomes. Beerus felt it immediately. Not as force, not as threat, as constraint. He stopped drifting and floated still, eyes narrowing as the void around him subtly resisted his presence. Space felt heavier, not in mass, but in insistence, like rules remembering themselves in his vicinity. He said, mildly intrigued, "So you do wake up." Below, Earth experienced the echo. The planet didn't shake this time, it steadied. Anomalies stopped escalating, not because they were resolved, but because they were capped. Reality stopped bending further, settling into a damaged but stable configuration. The chaos plateaued. People noticed. Markets reopened hesitantly. Flights resumed along newly recalculated paths. Emergency alerts downgraded from red to yellow. The world exhaled, mistaking containment for recovery. Vought seized the moment. Ashley Barrett stood before cameras again, face composed with corporate calm. "The worst instability has passed," she said. "Our world is resilient. Humanity adapts." She didn't mention Atlas. She didn't mention Beerus. She certainly didn't mention that none of this had been their doing. Homelander watched the broadcast from a recovery ward. His injuries healed, but something in him still fractured. The pressure was gone. The world felt solid again, predictable. He smiled, relief washing over him. "See," he murmured, "it just needed time." But time wasn't what had changed. The boys felt it too, but differently. Frowned at his instruments. "It's like the universe hit a ceiling." Frenchie nodded slowly. "We, like something very big, said enough." Butcher stared at the sky through a cracked window. "Yeah, and I don't think it said that for us." Beerus tested the resistance experimentally, lifting a finger and nudging space the way he always had. The distortion snapped back instantly, reality reasserting itself with polite firmness. "Not pain. Correction." Beerus blinked, surprised despite himself. "Interesting." He pushed harder, not out of anger but curiosity. The universe responded proportionally, tightening constraints without escalating. It wasn't fighting him. It was managing him. Far away, the custodian, damaged but functional, paused in its retreat and turned. It felt the same thing Beerus did, but interpreted it differently. This wasn't interference. It was oversight. The response system didn't announce itself. It didn't manifest as a being or voice. It existed as a distributed authority, a self-correcting framework that activated only when entities exceeded acceptable deviation thresholds across too many realities. Beerus had tripped it, not by destroying worlds, but by treating them as disposable. On Earth, people began noticing subtle changes in SUPs. Power stabilized but diminished slightly. Flight ceilings lowered. Energy outputs capped. Regeneration slowed. Compound V still worked, but it no longer pushed boundaries the way it once had. Vought called it optimization. Subs called it fatigue. Homelander tried to fly higher than before and hit an invisible limit, slamming into nothing with a startled grunt. He hovered there, stunned, then descended slowly, heart pounding. "What did you do?" he whispered to the sky. The sky didn't answer. Beerus finally frowned. He wasn't trapped, he wasn't threatened, but for the first time in this universe, he wasn't entirely free. Every movement now carried friction, not physical but conceptual. Actions had consequences that arrived faster, tighter, less forgiving. "Annoying," he said flatly. He considered leaving. The response anticipated that too. Space folded, not to block him, but to redirect him. Paths he would normally take no longer led cleanly out of the universe. Exit vectors blurred, overlapping into a lattice of probabilities that all curved back toward the same region of space. Earth. The universe wasn't punishing Beerus. It was containing the variable. Below, the boys watched as Homelander staged another appearance, trying to reclaim the narrative. He spoke of recovery, of resilience, of standing strong together. The crowd listened politely. No one cheered. Faith didn't come back just because the rules did. Butcher scoffed. "Look at him, still thinks this is about him." Huey nodded. Maybe that's the lesson it never was. Beerus hovered above the planet again, irritation simmering beneath boredom. "You want me to stay?" he said to no one. "Fine." He snapped his fingers, not to destroy but to test. Nothing happened. Beerus stared at his hand. Then slowly he smiled. "Oh," he said, "so that's how it is." The response adjusted again, not reacting to destruction, but to intent. Even contemplating large-scale erasure triggered constraints. The universe wasn't just managing outcomes anymore. It was watching decisions. That was new. Beerus crossed his arms, tail flicking. "You're very confident for something that hides." The response did not answer. It didn't need to. On Earth, the consequences settled into permanence. The world would go on changed, diminished, more cautious. Sups would never again feel limitless. Corporations would never again claim godhood without laughter following close behind. And somewhere above it all, a bored god realized he had been noticed by something that did not care about his title. Beerus glanced down at Earth, then out into the constrained void beyond. For the first time since arriving in this universe, he faced a choice he couldn't immediately ignore. Stay and push, or leave and accept boundaries. He exhaled slowly. He said, "Now this is interesting." Far below, instruments spiked one last time as the universe tightened its grip, preparing for whichever option he chose. Staying changed the rules. Not because Beerus demanded it, but because the universe adjusted to the decision the moment it was made. The constraints didn't tighten further. They settled. Like a contract silently signed, terms locking into place without ceremony or warning. Beerus felt it as a constant drag on potential, not weakness, not pain, a ceiling. The kind of ceiling that didn't stop you from moving, only from pretending there was no roof. He said, hovering above Earth's night side, "So that's the game." Below, the planet responded as if it had been waiting for permission to exhale. Systems stabilized into new normals. Not the old ones, those were gone, but patterns people could learn to live with. Storms followed tracks again. Seismic activity eased into predictable fault lines. The world stopped improvising and started enduring. The cost was everywhere. Sups across the globe reported permanent reductions. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines on its own. A few meters less altitude, slower healing. Powers that once surged now plateaued. Trainers called it burnout. Scientists blamed environmental recalibration. No one said what everyone felt. They had been capped. Vought adapted the way it always did, by lying more precisely. Ashley Barrett unveiled phase stability, a rebrand that reframed limitation as safety. SUPs were now regulated for public trust. New contracts included clauses about maximum output and operational ceilings. Shareholders were reassured. The public was told this was progress. Homelander felt the truth every time he tried to push past it. He hovered over Manhattan at dawn, straining upward until his muscles trembled, until the invisible resistance pressed him back down. Not violently, firmly, like a hand on his shoulder. No, the sky seemed to say. He descended slowly, face tight, jaw clenched. People looked up. Phones recorded. No cheers came, just quiet acknowledgement. He landed and smiled anyway. The boys watched the footage later in silence. "He's finished," Huey said softly. Butcher shook his head. "No, he's worse, he's alive." Beerus observed it all with mild interest. He wasn't invested in Homelander's collapse, but he appreciated the symmetry. A false god learning what ceilings felt like in a universe that had decided it had had enough of them. He tested the constraints again, this time carefully. Small actions passed unnoticed. Minor adjustments rippled without correction. The universe allowed play within bounds. Large intent still triggered resistance. "Annoying," Beerus repeated, but there was something else there now. A challenge not of strength but of patience. The response wasn't trying to beat him, it was waiting him out. Across deep space, the distributed authority refined itself, not as an opponent but as a filter. Beerus could exist. He could act. He could even destroy selectively. What he could not do was destabilize reality across scales, without immediate consequence. On Earth, the consequences became cultural. Faith in SUPs didn't vanish, it thinned. People stopped asking them to solve everything. Governments reclaimed authority they'd ceded out of fear and convenience. Oversight expanded. Borders tightened. The age of spectacle dimmed. Vought survived, but smaller. Homelander endured, but diminished. Beerus stayed and noticed something unexpected. He was bored again. Not the dangerous boredom of indifference, but the dull ache of repetition under constraint. The universe was consistent now, predictable, safe, uninteresting. He hovered above the planet's limb, watching sunrise crawl across continents that had learned to live with less. His tail flicked slowly. "So this is what you want," he said to the unseen framework. "Stability." The response did not answer. It didn't need to. Beerus considered leaving again. The paths out were still bent but not closed. He could force it, eventually. The cost would be real, not to him perhaps, but to the fabric holding this universe together. The response would escalate. Boundaries would harden. The damage would be tedious. He sighed. On Earth, Homelander made one last attempt to reclaim meaning. He staged a rescue during a controlled burn in California, pushing his reduced limits to the edge, collapsing afterward from exhaustion. Cameras captured the effort. The headlines praised the attempt. But the comments told the truth. He used to do more. Why did it look so hard? Is this the best we have now? Homelander read them all. That night, he screamed into a soundproof room until his voice broke. Beerus felt the emotional spike like static, irrelevant but noticeable. He glanced down, unimpressed. "Still noisy," he muttered. And yet something tugged at his attention. Not Earth's suffering, not its resilience. Its smallness. This universe had learned its place remarkably quickly. It no longer begged for gods. It didn't challenge them. It endured, adapted, and moved on. That was respectable. Beerus folded his arms. The response shifted subtly, sensing his contemplation. Not tightening, not loosening, waiting. "You're very patient," Beerus said. "I'm not." He raised a finger, not to destroy, but to decide. A single action, measured carefully within the constraints. a demonstration of presence without destabilization. Below, every soup on Earth felt it simultaneously. A pulse, not of power but of awareness. Every enhanced individual froze, hearts racing as the universe made one thing unmistakably clear. They were being observed. Not by Beerus, by something else. The response escalated not against Beerus but around Earth, refining limits further, locking sups into narrower bands. The message was clear. Stay small. Beerus's eyes narrowed. Oh, he said quietly, that's your answer. The universe had chosen preservation over potential, containment over curiosity. Beerus hovered there, considering the cost of staying just rose, and the cost of leaving would be higher still. Far below, alarms began sounding again, different from before. Not panic, not chaos. Finalization. The final change came quietly. No explosions, no tearing skis, no grand announcement etched into the clouds, just a subtle shift that people felt more than saw, like pressure easing from the air after a storm that never quite arrived. Instruments across the world registered it as a normalization event, a flattening of variables that had never belonged on the same graph before. The universe wasn't bracing anymore. It was letting go. Beerus hovered at the edge of Earth's influence, arms folded, eyes half-lidded as the response framework completed its work. Sups felt it instantly. Powers settled into their final limits, no longer fluctuating, no longer threatening to surge or collapse. What they had now was what they would always have. No growth. No ascension. Just maintenance. Beerus clicked his tongue. Predictable, he said, and dull. Below, the world adjusted one last time. Governments issued statements declaring the stabilization permanent. Emergency powers quietly transitioned into law. Oversight agencies expanded with little resistance. The public didn't protest. They were too tired, too aware of how fragile everything had proven to be. People wanted rules again. Vought survived the transition by becoming smaller and safer. No more gods, no more promises of perfection, just regulated assets with clearly defined ceilings and legally enforced limitations. Ashley Barrett signed the last set of documents with shaking hands, knowing exactly what era she was closing. The era where corporations pretended to be divine. Homelander stood on the roof of Vought Tower as dawn broke, cape hanging heavier than it ever had. He could feel the finality in his bones. Not a loss of power, he still had that, but a loss of possibility. He would never again be more than this. The sky felt closed. He looked up anyway, searching for a presence he knew wouldn't answer. Beerus was still there, somewhere beyond sight, but Homelander felt the distance growing. Not physical distance. Relevance. You didn't even finish it, Homelander whispered, voice cracking. You didn't even care. No reply came. The boys watched the same sunrise from a battered rooftop miles away. Huey leaned against the ledge, eyes heavy. So, that's it. Butcher took a long breath, the tension finally bleeding out of him. Yeah, that's it. MM frowned. Feels wrong, like we didn't win. Butcher snorted. We weren't meant to, nobody was. Kimiko signed slowly, her movements deliberate. The world survived. Barely, Huey said, and it feels smaller. Butcher nodded. Yeah, that's the price. Above them all, Beerus made his decision. Staying meant restraint, observation, existing inside a universe that had decided it would rather be limited than interesting. The response framework wasn't hostile, it wasn't afraid, it was content to wait him out forever if it had to. Beerus hated that. He unfolded his arms and stretched, a gesture that rippled through space just enough to remind the universe who he was without challenging its rules. The response held firm, acknowledging the motion but refusing to escalate. Beerus smirked. You win, he said casually. Enjoy your quiet. He turned, not forcing an exit, not tearing a hole, but slipping through a narrowing probability corridor the universe reluctantly allowed. The process took longer than it should have. The resistance was palpable. Space protested as Beerus disengaged himself from its constraints piece by piece. On Earth, no alarm sounded. No one knew it was happening. Except one thing. Every soup felt a release, not of power but of pressure. The sense of being watched faded. The invisible ceiling remained, but the weight above it lifted. The rules stayed. The judge left. Beerus paused one last time at the edge of the universe, glancing back at the small, stubborn planet that had dared to adapt to his boredom. Too serious, he muttered, too fragile. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, but resilient. He stepped out. The universe sealed behind him. Not triumphantly, not dramatically, just efficiently, like a system closing a file it no longer needed open. The response framework powered down to baseline, its purpose fulfilled. The anomaly was gone. Earth was alone again. Truly alone. Life continued. Sups operated within limits that would never be lifted. Homelander remained alive, visible, and diminished, a symbol not of godhood, but of a past humanity quietly chose not to revisit. Children stopped wearing his colors. Adults stopped looking to the sky for answers. Heroes became employees. Power became a responsibility instead of a promise. The boys faded back into the margins, their work less spectacular but more effective than it had ever been. There were no gods left to kill, no monsters pretending to be saviors, just systems to resist and people to protect. The world didn't heal. It stabilized. And far beyond its reach, Beerus drifted back into a cosmos that still bent easily to his presence, already forgetting the small universe that had bored him into leaving it intact. Earth would never know how close it had come to meaning nothing at all. And that ignorance, more than any god's mercy, was what allowed it to keep going. The universe did not remember Beerus as a destroyer here. It remembered him as the god who got bored and walked away. And